Good evening, 4-3. Today we're going to be beginning our lesson on 13-4, fractions and decimals. How can you write a fraction as a decimal and a decimal as a fraction? Decimals and fractions, they go hand in hand. The way you would read a fraction is the same way you'd read a decimal, and vice versa. Look at this decimal place value chart. When you have done regular standard numbers, you're used to seeing this type of place value chart, where you're used to seeing the ones, the tens, the hundreds, the thousands. You're used to seeing this type of place value chart. But what's different now is that we've added a decimal point, and that is when we're saying the word end. Over here, next to the right of the decimal point, you're going to see the tenths. You're going to see the hundredths, the thousandths, and it continues. This is the denominator of the fraction. This side is the whole number, and this side is the fraction part. Here's an example. On Kelsey Street, 6 out of 10 homes have swing sets in their backyards. You need to write 6/10 as a decimal. Now remember, when we did fractions together, we did 10/10 always equaled a whole. Now in Kelsey Street, not everybody had swing sets. Only 6 out of the 10. So not everyone had a swing set in their backyard. Only 6 homes out of the 10 homes had swing sets. So we're used to seeing that as a fraction, 6/10. But now we have to create this as a decimal. 6/10, or 0.6, is how many houses have swings. If everybody had swings, all of this would be colored in, because that would represent 10/10, a whole. But not everybody has a swing set in their backyard. So this model represents, it's broken up into tenths, and only 6 out of the 10 are shaded in. So if we refer back to our decimal place value chart, we would locate where the tenths, the denominator is the tenths, where is the tenths on the place value chart? Here's our decimal point, and it's always to the right of the decimal point, and there's the tenths. So how we would write that is, there is no whole, then comes our decimal point, and since the numerator is 6, and it's only 6/10, because the denominator is telling us the place that it's in, we would put a 6. So this represents 6/10. Let's say our fraction is 52 hundredths. Let's locate the hundredths on the place value chart. Here's the decimal, and everything is to the, when it comes to fractions, it's to the right of the decimal. Here is the tenths, but our denominator is saying the hundredths. Here is the hundredths. So let's bring down our decimal. We do not have a whole number. That's to the left of the decimal. And we're going to write 52 hundredths, because the 2 is in the hundredths place. Okay, now we see a fraction of 8/10. Let's look at our decimal place value chart. Notice that there is no whole number in this next to this fraction. This is not a mixed number. This is just a fraction. So we are not going to look at to the left of the decimal point because this represents the whole number. There is no whole number in this next to this fraction. So we're going to focus to the right of the decimal point because this is the fractional part. Notice the denominator, and this is the tenths. So we'll locate the tenths. Here's the tenths. So now we're going to put our decimal point. Actually, we're going to say no whole number. Bring down our decimal point, the tenths, and we write 8. And we would say this decimal like we would say the fraction, 8 tenths. 8 tenths because the 8 is in the tenths part of the place value chart. Okay, well here's another example. In Rolling Hills, 0.75 of the houses are two-story homes. Write 0.75 as a fraction. That is how we would normally read it because that's what it looks like. But that's not the correct way of saying it. We would actually have to say, instead of saying 0.75, we would say 75 hundredths. Or, as a fraction, it would look like this. 75 over 100. Because 75, here's our model, 75 is colored in out of 100 of those boxes. If 100 of the homes in Rolling Hills were all had two-story homes, then all of this would be colored in. So that would end up being 100 out of 100, which we know equals a whole. But since only 75 of them have it, it would be 75 over 100. Now, how we know that this turns into 75 hundredths as a decimal, because the 5 is in the hundredths place if we refer back to our place value decimal chart. Since you know that with fractions, we always have to find equivalent fractions, or we always have to make sure that our fractions are reduced or simplified. This is why you see this here, 3/4. Because if you simplified 75 hundredths, you would get 3/4 as your simplified fraction. If we go back to our decimal place value chart, you will see that 0.75 is the same as 75 hundredths. You would read them the exact same way. So let's look. We have no whole number. So over here to the left of the decimal, this is what would represent our whole number. To the right of the decimal, this would represent the fractional part. So here's the 7. The 7 would be in the tenths, and the 5 would be in the hundredths. So that's how we can take a fraction and convert it into a decimal. I just want to make sure that you know there is no such thing as once. Okay? The only time you're going to hear ones is if there's a whole number. Right after, to the right of the decimal point, it always starts with the tenths. Never, there's no such thing as once. Let's practice this again. 0.32. That is the way it looks. But how do we correctly say that? As a decimal and converting it into a fraction. If we see over here, the 2 is in what place? So let's look at our decimal place value chart. There is no whole number. There is no whole number. So we're just going to ignore the left-hand side. We look at the decimal, and to the right of the decimal is the fraction part. The 3 is in the tenths place, and the 2 is in the hundredths place. So we would say 32 hundredths, because it's in the 2 is in the hundredths place. A tenth is one of 10 equal parts. of a whole. So here's our model, and it's cut up into 10 pieces, and only one is colored in. So we know that as a fraction, this is 1/10. And this is the way this would be rewritten as a decimal, 1/10, because the 1 is in the tenths part of our decimal place value chart. A hundredth is one of 100 equal parts of a whole. So here's our model, and it's broken up into 100, into hundreds. It's into 100 little pieces. And only one is colored in. So as a fraction, this would represent 1/100, 1/100ths. But as a decimal, it would be written like this, because the 1 is in the hundredths place. If we refer back to our decimal place value chart, this 0 right here represents the tenths, and this 0 represents the whole. All right, well, let's look at this grid. This grid has been cut up into 10 pieces, but only 3 have been shaded in. So we know as a fraction, this represents 3/10. But what does it equal as a decimal? Okay, there is no whole, so we do not have to look at the left-hand side. This is not a mixed number, it's just a fraction. And then we notice that the decimal point is right here, so let's bring down the decimal point. And then we locate where the tenths is. Since this is cut up into 10 pieces, we need to locate the tenths place. And over here is the tenths place. And what is in the tenths place? What number? We look at the numerator, and it's a 3. So it's 3/10. This is what this fraction would equal as a decimal. It's the same thing, and we would read it the same way as we read it as a fraction, 3/10. Here's another grid. This grid, again, is broken up into 10 pieces. But how many are colored in? 8 of them are colored in. So we know as the fraction, since it's cut up into 10 pieces, and that is our denominator, and 8 are colored in, it would represent 8/10. But what does this look like as a decimal? Okay, so there's our fraction, 8/10, and here is our grid. And there is no whole number. This is not a mixed number, so we would not look to the left of the decimal point. There is no whole. We are going to look to the right of the decimal because that's our fraction, our fractional part. So notice, here's our decimal, and we are going to look for the tenths because that's what our denominator says. This is what this grid is broken up into, 10 pieces. So where is tenths? Right here. And the numerator, it's broken up into 8 pieces. So this represents 8/10, 0.8. 8/10 is the same as we're going to say as a decimal. 0.8 is 8/10. Here's another grid, but this grid is broken up into 100 hundredths. So we know our fraction, our denominator, is going to be 100 because that's what it's broken up into. But how many are colored in? And each one of these equals 10. So there are 30. There's been 30 that has been colored in this grid. So how would we say this? Well, we're used to saying this because we're used to dealing with fractions. 30 hundredths. But what about a decimal? What would that look like as a decimal? Okay, in this fraction, there is no whole number. This is not a mixed number, so we will not be looking to the left-hand side of the decimal. We're going to bring down our decimal point. And where is our 0? What place is the 0 in? Well, the 3 is the tenths, and that 0 is the hundredths. So let's bring down the 0 there. So this becomes 30 hundredths. 30 hundredths, because the 0 is in the hundredths place. All right, well, here's an example of a mixed number, and we would read this as 8 and 5/10. So we do have a whole, and that is to the left of the decimal point. So if we want to convert this into a decimal, we want to put our whole, and then we're going to bring down our decimal point. So 8 and. Look at the denominator. The denominator is the tenths. Locate the tenths on the place value chart. Here it is. So we know that this numerator 5 has to be placed in the tenths column. So this set reads 8 and 5/10, just like we would be reading it as a fraction. Can you now convert a decimal into a fraction? Well, how would we read this? This is the way it looks, 0.62. But how would we read this correctly? We would say 0 and 62 hundredths, because the 2 is in the hundredths place. So how would we write this as a fraction? Just the way we just said it. 62, and the 2 is in the hundredths place. All right, let's see what you have learned. This grid isn't broken up into hundredths. Please give me the fraction and the decimal that represents this grid. What about this one? How would we read 8.4 and convert it into a fraction? Please convert 8.4 into a fraction. Notice that I am not actually saying it and reading it correctly, because that would end up giving you the answer. Try this one, 83 over 100. How can we convert that into a decimal? What would the decimal look like for 83 over 100? All right, what about this one? 3 and 8 over 10 equals what as a decimal? What would the decimal look like? Again, I am not reading this mixed number correctly, because if I did, that would help you get the answer. 7 over 10. What would that look like as a decimal? 0.9. How would that look like as a fraction? Excellent job tonight, guys. Keep up the great work.